Hello and welcome to another baffling, buffoonery-filled episode of What Happened, the show that tests your brittle faith in the video game industry, makes you ponder the meaning of existence, and constantly has you begging for the answer to the eternal question, Sonic 06. What? Who? Why? What? Okay, not so fast there, Hedgehogs. To properly tell the tale of one of the biggest failures in electronic entertainment, you, dear viewers, and especially Sonic fans, should grab your crucifixes and/or Bibles. It's gonna be one bumpy ride through developmental hell. 2006 was going to be a banner year for Sega. Yeah, they didn't exactly become the big chili dog of third parties that they sought out to become back in 2001, but the industry was heading into the HD era, so there was a chance to start fresh. Part of this new plan was to make a high-definition, sexy, slick-looking, sensual Sonic the Hedgehog title that would also culminate with the Blue Blur's 15th anniversary. It would also be the launch game for the assuredly successful PlayStation 3 and be a moneymaker for the Xbox 360, which was starting to hit its sales stride at that point. But, oh, what's this? Nintendo's making a new console too? Shit, well, we gotta have Sonic on that. It was like Sega had a t-shirt launching bazooka, but instead of clothing, it was just crammed with Sonic's twisted, broken body, which will then just shot out in all directions, and Sega figured they'd hit their target eventually. The game would go on to be simply dubbed Sonic the Hedgehog, and was meant to be the new starting point for the franchise, spearheaded by impressive visuals wowing pretty much everyone who laid eyes on it. But behind closed doors at Sonic Team, things they weren't going well. Through various, mostly hilarious reasons, the Wii version of Sonic 2006 hit a few, shall we say, snags. And by snags, I mean it was cancelled. The development team were split in twain, Sonic's father walked away from Sega, and the release date of the game, for even more hilarious reasons, could not budge. It had to come out by the end of 2006, and when it did, it left a permanent poop stain on the Hedgehog's chest, a legacy that from that point onward could never really be scrubbed off.
Sonic was never good.
So, what happened? To fully unravel the enormity of Sega's failure to kick off a new generation on the right foot, let's take a light speed dash backwards to the raunchy, filthy, morally corrupt year of 2004. Shun Nakamura, the director of such Sega titles as Samba de Amigo and Billy Who and the Giant Wah, received word from his bosses at Sega that they were fast-tracking a big Sonic reboot to coincide with the 15th anniversary of the franchise that was also set to debut on the new generation of consoles. He was to take up the task of senior game designer on the project. Directing duties would fall to one Yojiro Ogawa, while the producer role would be filled by Yuji Naka, one of the original masterminds behind Sonic. One final team member was also added to the staff, and that was Yoshinari Amake, who had spent most of his 2004 working on a prototype for a quote-unquote realistic game that would use the Havoc physics engine, until Sega just canceled the whole thing outright. He was then moved on to Sonic's big 15th birthday barfarama during the planning stages when they were still trying to suss out exactly what it was going to be. With the graphical power of next-gen systems available to them, the team decided on the idea of placing Sonic in a more detailed and grounded world, to which Amake suggested they use the prototype of the game he had been working on as a base, with the player being able to interact with a lot of physics-based objects. This was not a good idea. While full-time development didn't kick off until early 2005, it wasn't long before Sega demanded some sort of demo be put together to show the press at E3 of that year. Since this was the first HD game the team had worked on, paired with the complexity of using the Havoc physics engine, they only had time to squeeze out a non-playable presentation which showed Sonic moving across a grassy landscape and enter some temple ruins. While it was merely showing off the tone and scale of what they were going for, most game journalists were excited by what they saw. Now, once E3 was over and the team returned to working on the game in full, things began to get terrible. The problem with tech demos is that they're usually made to just express what the team hopes to achieve and not strictly what's possible. And in this case, almost everything turned out to be very much impossible. Since Sega is a Japanese company, emphasis was put on prioritizing the PlayStation 3 version of Sonic the Hedgehog since, the Xbox brand was always kinda considered the biggest laughingstock of the century to Japanese fans. The 360 version would be a port, with the Wii iteration also seeing the same treatment, that is until Sega finally received the specs for the machine from Nintendo. Very sharpish, Ogawa could see that the Wii version would require crap loads more work to port over, and decided to split the main team into two groups. One would work exclusively on the Wii, while the remaining staff would continue on the PS3. Even more quickly, Ogawa realized even that wouldn't be possible, and told Sega porting down to the Wii specs wasn't really a thing, and they would need to make a whole new game from the ground up, and that he would direct that title personally. This game would go on to be Sonic and the Secret Rings, or at that time be known under the much cooler moniker of Sonic Wildfire. Ogawa's next step was to move even more staff over to Secret Wildfire Rings and got to work, leaving the HD Sonic without a director. Shun Nakamura was then thrust into the position with little notice, and having only worked in that role on much smaller games, simply wasn't prepared for the Herculean task ahead of him. He had to pick up the pieces from Ogawa, but his team had been gutted, and in the most Sega-like behavior ever, Sega didn't add any additional talent to bolster their ranks, so they would need to soldier on with whoever they had left. Later that year, in October of 2005, the company would publicly announce that Sonic the Hedgehog would see release the next year for the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, and would be returned to form for the mascot. Development, however, was still going slow, and Nakamura could see that they would need to drastically start cutting back on the game's scale and what was outlined during its planning phase. In earlier leaked gameplay demos, there was going to be a dynamic day and night cycle, and a much more fleshed out hub world for Sonic to explore, not just the depressing gulag that was Soliana. Ever wonder why the objective "Go to the desert" appears early on in the game? Well, that's a holdover to where there were different hubs for Sonic to explore. Originally, there was going to be desert and snow environments, but all were eventually cut and folded into Soliana. Phew, even at this stage, problems were just piling up, but at least Nakamura could ask seasoned Sonic veteran Yuji Naka for help and guidance to, he's left the company. In March of 2006, Mr. Naka announced he was leaving his position within Sega to form his own company, Probe, stating that Sega had stuck him in a managerial role he had become unhappy with and wanted just to get back to creating and developing himself. This departure had been rumored for months, and while it was a loss for Sega, it was a much more devastating loss to Nakamura and his team, or what was left of his team, because guess what? When Yuji left, he took even more staff with him.
This is terrible!
Just who's working on this thing now? At this point, Nakamura's grabbing janitors and sitting them down at workstations. He also then decided to take the only sane option left, which was cut even more content to make that release date. While we covered some examples of gameplay-focused exclusions like the hub worlds, this also had a ripple effect across other areas of the game, such as the script and voice acting.
Have you retrieved the Book of Darkness?
Because the game's story was constantly changing to keep up with the amount of shit hitting the chopping block, some things still sort of just slipped through, like the Scepter of Darkness. This MacGuffin went through a lot of name changes up until the 11th hour, with one of those earlier ones being the Book of Darkness, which is still referenced in the final game. This is one of the biggest, but not the only reason why Sonic 2006's plot is fractured, unfocused, and generally really creepy and awkward. However, the team couldn't spend their time ironing out plot details when they had a lot more pressing matters to address, like falling out of the world and 2-minute-long load times. But in fact, they didn't have time to even address that stuff because that's all still in the game. Their main goal was to simply slap all this shit together. E3 2006 was looming, and Nakamura and the three people working under him realized they needed to make the game at least completable in time for its release date that fall. Now, up until this point, Sonic 06 had never had a hands-on demo available to the public before, and while it wasn't really ready, this was the last E3 before launch, so they had to show something. The demo consisted of a Sonic and Silver section, and for whatever reason, Silver was originally envisioned to be an orange mink named Venice, but was changed to an edgy, serious character to join the never-ending parade of edgy, serious characters the franchise had been building up.
Hey, you're not Sonic!
Reception to the demo was mixed, to say the least. Most of the emotions that rack the soul when playing the final version of Sonic 06, like depression, sadness, frustration, and revulsion, were echoed during this E3. It was still very unpolished. Sonic would get killed easily by innocently misplaced jumps, running into things, and many other hallmarks that the game instituted. Still though, it was a product in development. It was of course pre-alpha, so a lot of early previews stated that it would undoubtedly see a bevy of improvements. And it did, but not really. The next major blip on Sonic's treaded, corpse-laden path to release was September 27th at Microsoft's X06 event, which presented a brand new build of Sonic that featured many improvements to the core gameplay. Although, in a twist that could only happen to Sonic, these improvements were never actually implemented into the main game. See, sometime in early 2006, Sega upper management had struck a deal with Microsoft to promote the game as a more Xbox 360 focused title, putting most of their marketing muscle behind that version in the West, while the PS3 would be the dominant one in Japan. Due to this, the demo of Sonic at Microsoft's event had a few extra levels of polish that the Xbox 360 porting team had time to get out the door. The camera received a lot of tweaks and was more dynamic. Sonic's run animations off boost pads were not as stiff and robotic. His homing attack had a nice forward arc that would maintain momentum, and of course there were numerous bug fixes when interacting with walls and pretty much every other obstacle. These were all tiny improvements, but there were so many of them that this demo is seen as the superior version of the game. However, since the main SKU from a developmental standpoint was the PS3, with the 360 version being the port, these changes were discarded once the new PS3 build was available and were never integrated back into the main developmental pipeline. This improved demo was also released publicly on the 360 marketplace, so lots of fans that went hands-on with this had no idea of all the delights that the final version would show them. This deal with Microsoft further complicated matters, as part of it seemingly was that the game had to release by the end of the year with no room for compromise. And even if that weren't the case, Sega had already mandated that it had to make Sonic's 15th anniversary anyway, so a delay was not in the cards. But why? Well, Sonic and the Secret Rings had slipped to a 2007 release date and would miss the Wii's launch, so Sega was unwilling to budge on both games missing the big stupid birthday that nobody really cared about but them. Release the games when they're good, not just to coincide with some fucking fictitious woodland animal's fake birthday. Like, what are you, crazy? Thus, on the dreaded day of November 14th, the game was released on both consoles, with the PS3 version actually winding up with an improved frame rate, but it was of little comfort to the legions of Sonic fans that had been wrapped in anticipation/dread. While the fastest thing alive had a few rough patches in his career up to that point, the glove finger could always be pointed at those titles being weird spin-offs developed by Western teams or any other excuses one could make, but no one could excuse this. The game would then get slammed from pretty much every publication in existence, except for one, of course. 06 was criticized for its incredibly lengthy, numerous load times, poor optimization, buggy gameplay, confusing story, huge reliance on non-interactive cutscenes.
How long is this gonna go on?
And a distinct lack of anything really next-gen about how it played. This was supposed to be Sonic's splashy comeback into a new generation and a big anniversary event of the franchise's longevity, but it wound up simply being a standard bearer for why Sega could never really get the Hedgehog's games working as well in 3D as many of his contemporaries did. Knowing all of this, we can at least see the massive amount of reasons as to why the game failed so spectacularly. Unrealistic demands by Sega, the departure of Yuji Naka, unfamiliar hardware and technology, and of course, the splitting of the teams irreversibly destroying any chances it had to be a quality product. What's more, Sonic and the Secret Rings, while trying a number of different things, wasn't left without its own blemishes and naysayers. Frustrating controls and design made it fairly divisive, but it wasn't something that couldn't have been fixed by both teams getting the proper manpower and time to deliver on their promises. Sega was/is said to be mortified by the failure to this day, a sentiment shared by the actual team members, with Nakamura simply stating, "Development on next-generation machines proved to be very difficult for us, with many things we didn't understand. Comprehending the variety of new technologies, the new hardware, handling the enormous amount of information, these were all aspects that far surpassed both my expectations and experience." Upon its launch and critical drubbing, Sega also cancelled plans for a proposed Windows version of the title, something that was teased in E3 brochures that threatened the game would curse PCs sometime after the launch of the console iterations. Sega even doubled down on this in the instruction booklet for the PC version of Sonic Freeriders, the first of the racing trilogy that further cemented the Hedgehog's plummeting reputation that same year. Sega even went out of their way to delist the games on demand version of Sonic 06 in 2010 because of the perception it was still damaging the brand years later. But to be fair, this was probably one of the only smart decisions they made in regards to this whole debacle. It's also pretty clear that some of the cut concepts and ideas from 06 sped their way into the follow-up, Sonic Unleashed, including the day-night cycle, multiple hubs, and more momentum-based gameplay, until of course Sega decided to take a werehog-sized poop load all over that potential. It's been 13 years, and Sonic Team has had some definite highs and some undeniable lows since, and the major players that were at the helm have had similar seesaw-like careers. Shun Nakamura would go on to direct the charming Rhythm Thief and the Emperor's Treasure, but would also be one of the main producers behind Sonic Forces. Yujiro Okawa left the company in 2012 and seemingly hasn't returned to game development since. Yuji Naka would never find the success he had with Sega again, producing titles such as Let's Tap, Ivy the Kiwi, and Rodeo the Sky Soldier, before moving on to Square Enix in 2018 in an unknown capacity. And thus concludes the story of Sonic 2006, a game which rocked the franchise so hard it never really recovered from it, at least not fully. While certain talented fans have brought some much needed positivity back to the series, many missteps have been made since then, all of them ripe for more what happens of their own. And if you'd like to toss one of those bloated blue carcasses up on our stage, let me know in the comments below or send an angry email about how you think Sonic 06 still has some redeeming qualities at McMuscles@gmail.com. Thanks for watching!